Please close your eyes for just a moment. Can you hear the slow, rhythmic ticking of the old mechanical clock on the wall? Can you smell the faint, acrid smoke of the burning coal briquettes mingling with the sweet, earthy aroma of roasting sweet potatoes? Welcome back to a time we thought we had left far behind. Today we are going back to the 1970s and 80s in China. We are going to remember 20 cheap, simple foods that we relied on to survive when our pockets were empty and the grain ration coupons dictated our lives. These were not fancy dishes. Some were rough, some were bitter, and some we ate so often we swore we would never touch them again. Yet, looking back, they were the taste of our youth, the taste of a mother's fierce love, and the taste of a time when we had nothing, but somehow had enough. Stay with me until the very end, because the last thing on our list is a sweet, sticky childhood treasure traded for scraps, one that will surely bring a warm tear to your eye. Life flowed differently back then. Time moved at the slow, deliberate pace of a heavy bicycle pedaling through a dusty alleyway. We did not have the endless distractions of modern technology, nor did we have refrigerators full of endless choices. Everything we ate was governed by the delicate slips of paper known as food stamps, which were more precious than actual currency. There is a common myth today that because our lives were materially impoverished, we were emotionally deprived. But if you lived through it, you know the exact opposite is true. The scarcity we faced forced us to rely on each other. Neighbors shared their meager harvests of winter cabbage. Families gathered around a single low-wattage light bulb to eat coarse cornmeal. And every meal was a testament to human resourcefulness. We waited patiently for the spring to forage for wild herbs, and we cherished the rare drops of oil as if they were liquid gold. The lack of material wealth meant that our emotional connections, our patience, and our gratitude for a simple bowl of warm porridge were infinitely deeper than what we see in the fast-paced world of today. Do you remember the rough texture of the steamed cornmeal bread sliding down your throat? In the 1970s, when wheat flour was a luxury reserved for the new year, cornmeal was the faithful companion of our everyday lives. Making this bread was an art born out of necessity. Mothers would mix the coarse yellow cornmeal with just enough water, perhaps adding a little baking soda if they were lucky, and knead it with the hands weathered by hard work. They would shape the dough into perfect little cones, pressing their thumb into the bottom to create a hollow space so it would steam evenly. When the heavy wooden lid was lifted off the large iron wok, the steam would billow out, filling the small kitchen with a sweet, earthy aroma. It was not a delicate food. Sometimes it was so dry and scratchy that it felt like swallowing sand, and we had to wash it down with sips of hot water or thin porridge. But hunger was the best seasoning. We would hold that hot golden cone in our hands, blowing on it to cool it down, taking small, deliberate bites. It filled our bellies and gave us the strength to run through the narrow alleyways until the sun went down. Today people eat this cornmeal bread in fancy restaurants as a healthy novelty, made soft and sweet with refined flour and sugar. But they will never know the true taste of that coarse cornbread, the taste of survival, of a mother's endless resourcefulness, and of a time when we had so little, yet shared absolutely everything. And what about the smell of sweet potatoes roasting in the ashes of the honeycomb coal stove? In the winter months, when the biting wind howled through the narrow alleyways, this humble root vegetable was our absolute savior. Sweet potatoes were cheap, abundant, and filling, so we ate them morning, noon, and night. Our mothers would boil them into a watery soup for breakfast, steam them for lunch, and if we were lucky, bury small ones in the dying embers of the stove for an evening treat. The skin would turn black and charred, But when you broke it open, the bright orange flesh inside was piping hot and incredibly sweet. Sometimes a sticky caramelized syrup would ooze out, sticking to your fingers and lips. We would pass the hot potato from hand to hand, blowing on it, our faces smeared with black soot, laughing in the dim light of a low-wattage bulb. Back then, we ate so many sweet potatoes that some of us swore we would never touch them again once we grew up. We got tired of the acid reflux and the endless monotony of the meals. But today, when you walk past a street vendor selling roasted sweet potatoes, doesn't that familiar, comforting aroma instantly transport you back to that cramped, freezing kitchen? It is the smell of survival, of a family huddling together for warmth, and of a childhood where the simplest things brought us the most profound and lasting joy. Think back to the rare and magical days when your mother would buy a piece of fat pork with our monthly meat ration coupons. Meat was a luxury we saw only a few times a month, and lean meat was not what we wanted. We wanted the thick white fat, because fat meant oil, and oil meant survival. The ritual of rendering lard was an event the whole family anticipated. Your mother would cut the fat into small cubes and toss them into the hot iron wok. Soon a rich, intoxicating sizzle would fill the air, and the whole courtyard would know your family was cooking meat. The clear liquid gold would be carefully poured into a ceramic jar to be sparingly used for months to come. But the real treasure was what was left behind in the wok. Those little golden, crispy morsels of pork fat residue were the ultimate indulgence. Your mother would sprinkle just a tiny pinch of coarse sea salt over them and hand you one. Do you remember the crunch? It was a loud, satisfying crackle, followed by a burst of savory, rich flavor that coated your tongue. We would chew them slowly, wanting the taste to last forever, because we knew it would be a long time before we experienced it again. Today we avoid fat for the sake of our health, but back then, those salty, crunchy cracklings were a vital source of energy, a rare delicacy that made our hard lives feel momentarily wealthy and blessed. As November approached in those years, the streets of northern cities would turn into seas of green and white. Do you recall the monumental task of winter cabbage storage? Cabbage was not just a vegetable. It was our lifeline for the long, frozen months ahead. Families would buy hundreds of pounds of cabbage all at once. We children would help our parents transport the massive, heavy heads of cabbage on flatbed tricycles or wooden carts, our breath puffing white in the crisp autumn air. We would stack them meticulously against the wall of the courtyard or on the balcony, covering them with old cotton quilts or canvas tarps to protect them from the frost. From that day on, cabbage was on the menu every single day until the spring thaw. We ate it boiled in clear water, stir-fried with a drop of precious oil, mixed with cornmeal, or chopped into a sparse filling for dumplings on New Year's Eve. We knew the taste of its pale green leaves so intimately that we could almost taste it in our dreams. Sometimes the outer leaves would rot and the smell of decaying cabbage would linger in the air, but we never threw anything away. We peeled off the bad parts and cherished the sweet, tender heart inside. We used to complain about eating it endlessly, yet looking back, that towering wall of cabbage represented a mother's foresight, a family's security, and the unbreakable resilience of our generation. There were evenings when our parents worked late at the factory, and hunger would gnaw at our bellies. In those moments, the most luxurious feast we could invent was a simple bowl of soy sauce mixed with rice. Do you remember the rough texture of the blue and white porcelain bowl in your hands? We would scoop out whatever leftover rice was sitting in the pot. It was often cold and hard, so we would pour a little hot water over it to loosen the grains. Then came the magic ingredient. We would take the heavy glass bottle of dark soy sauce and carefully, almost holding our breath, let a few drops fall into the bowl. If we were incredibly fortunate, we might scrape a tiny dab of solid white lard from the ceramic jar and bury it under the warm rice to let it melt. The heat would release the rich, savory aroma of the fermented soybeans and the comforting smell of the pork fat. We would mix it furiously with our bamboo chopsticks until every single grain was coated in a beautiful amber color. Sitting on a small wooden stool, eating that salty, greasy rice in the dim evening light, we felt like kings. It was a dish born out of sheer scarcity, devoid of meat or vegetables, but it tasted better than any modern banquet. That simple bowl of soy sauce rice taught us how to find immense pleasure in the smallest of things, a lesson that has stayed with us for a lifetime. When the harsh winter finally broke and the first green shoots pierced the thawing earth, a wave of excitement would sweep through the neighborhood children. Do you remember the springtime ritual of digging for wild edible herbs? Armed with small woven bamboo baskets and rusty iron trowels, we would run out to the fields, the riverbanks, and the edges of the dirt roads. We were on a treasure hunt for shepherd's purse, dandelion leaves, and wild amaranth. We learned from our mothers exactly which leaves were safe to eat and which were bitter or poisonous. It was a game of survival disguised as childhood play. We would spend hours under the pale spring sun, our hands covered in damp, fragrant soil, filling our baskets with the tender green leaves. When we brought our harvest home, our mothers would wash the dirt away and plunge the herbs into boiling water. Sometimes they were chopped up and mixed into our coarse cornmeal dough to make steamed buns, or simply tossed with a few drops of dark vinegar and salt. The taste was sharp, grassy, and sometimes overwhelmingly bitter, but it was the fresh taste of spring. It was nature's free gift to a hungry population. Today these wild herbs are sold at premium prices in organic markets, but they can never replicate the sweet victory of a child pulling a perfect green leaf from the earth, knowing they were helping to feed their family. In a time when side dishes were a rare luxury, the small glass jar of fermented bean curd held a place of absolute honor in our homes. Do you remember the intense, pungent smell that would hit your nose as soon as the metal lid was twisted off? Inside were small, soft cubes of tofu, bathed in a fiery red or rich brown chili and oil sauce, fermenting slowly over time. Because it was so incredibly salty and flavorful, we were never allowed to eat a whole piece at once. That small jar had to last the family for an entire month. Our mothers would carefully lift a single cube onto a small saucer. The rule was strict but unspoken. You only gently scraped the surface of the bean curd with the very tip of your chopstick. That tiny microscopic smear of red paste, bursting with complex, savory and spicy flavors, was enough to carry you through 3 huge mouthfuls of bland, watery porridge. We mastered the art of making a little go a very long way. The rich, creamy texture melting on the tongue provided a sharp contrast to the coarse grains we relied on for sustenance. Whenever someone was sick and had lost their appetite, a tiny bit of fermented bean curd was the only thing that could make the plain rice gruel swallowable. It was the absolute essence of flavor in an era of blandness, teaching us the profound value of restraint and deep appreciation. Summer evenings in those years brought the rare and magnificent treat of a whole watermelon, chilled in a bucket of cold well water. But the feast did not end when the red, sweet flesh was eaten down to the white edge. Do you remember how meticulously we treated the watermelon rind? In a time when nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever wasted, the thick green skin was a valuable resource. After we children had enthusiastically devoured the sweet fruit, our faces sticky with pink juice, our mothers would collect the discarded crescents. With a sharp cleaver, they would skillfully peel away the tough, dark green outer skin, leaving only the pale, firm white rind. They would slice it into thin, translucent strips. Sometimes these strips were tossed with coarse salt, smashed garlic, and a splash of vinegar to make a crisp, refreshing cold salad that crunched loudly in our mouths. Other times they were stir-fried in a hot wok with a dried chili pepper, transforming into a savory, tender vegetable dish that stretched our meager dinner portions. What modern families throw straight into the garbage bin, our mothers magically turned into a second course. Eating the rind was not a choice. It was an ingrained philosophy of life. We respected every ounce of food the earth provided, and in return, those humble, crunchy strips of watermelon rind taught us that creativity could easily conquer scarcity. There was a brief, magical window in the middle of spring when the tall elm trees lining the streets would suddenly bloom with pale green, coin-shaped seeds. We called them elm coins, and they were the most delightful free snack a child could find. Do you remember the thrill of climbing those rough-barked trees? The bravest boys would scramble up the high branches, breaking off small twigs heavily laden with the delicate green clusters, and toss them down to the younger children waiting eagerly below. We would strip the elm coins off the branches by the handful and stuff them directly into our mouths. They were tender, slightly sweet, and carried the pure, vibrant essence of fresh spring air. But the real feast happened when we carried our hats and pockets full of elm coins back to our mothers. They would wash them, mix them with coarse wheat or corn flour, and steam them in the large iron wok. The steaming process softened the raw, grassy taste, turning the mixture into a soft, fluffy, slightly sweet bread that we dipped in garlic sauce. It was a highly anticipated seasonal delicacy, born from a desperate need to forage for survival. Yet it felt like a grand festival. Today the elm trees still bloom, scattering their green coins onto the concrete pavements to be swept away, while we long for just one more bite of that sweet, steamed spring memory. In the cold, dark winters, the honeycomb coal stove was the beating heart of our homes. It provided warmth, boiled our water, and created one of the most comforting snacks of our childhood. Do you remember the smell of toasted, steamed buns? When the fluffy white bread from yesterday had gone completely cold, dry, and hard as a rock, throwing it away was an unthinkable sin. Instead, our mothers would slice the stiff bun into thick pieces and carefully arrange them around the outer rim of the burning coal stove. This required patience and a watchful eye. We children would sit on small wooden stools, watching the edges of the white dough slowly turn a beautiful, deep golden brown. If you left it too long, it would burn and turn bitter, but if you timed it perfectly, the transformation was miraculous. We would take the hot slices off the stove, tossing them between our palms so as not to burn our fingers. The outside was incredibly crisp, with a toasted, smoky flavor that echoed the burning coal, while the inside had miraculously become soft and warm again. The sound of crunching into a toasted slice echoed in the quiet kitchen. It was the simplest alchemy, turning stale, unappetizing leftovers into a warm, crunchy delight that filled our stomachs and warmed our frozen hands before we braved the snowy, wind-swept streets. When autumn winds began to blow, the rooftops and courtyards of every neighborhood were draped with long, white strings drying in the sun. This was the season of making dried turnip strips, a process that secured our winter food supply. Do you remember the sharp, earthy smell of the massive white radishes being chopped by the dozens? Our mothers would slice them into long, thick strips, heavily salt them to draw out the moisture, and hang them on cotton threads across the courtyard lines. Day by day, the plump white strips would shrink, wither, and turn a pale golden brown, soaking in the autumn sunshine and the crisp air. Once dried, they were stored away in large ceramic vats. When winter arrived and fresh vegetables were nothing but a memory, These dried strips were our salvation. Soaked in hot water to soften, then chopped into small pieces and mixed with a few drops of chili oil and soy sauce, they became incredibly chewy and flavorful. The texture was unforgettable, resisting the teeth, requiring long, deliberate chewing that made a loud, satisfying crunch in the quiet morning kitchen. Eating them with a bowl of watery cornmeal porridge provided the much-needed contrast in texture and taste. Every single bite of that resilient, sun-dried radish carried the warmth of the autumn sun into the darkest, coldest days of our childhood winters. In an era where candy was a rare luxury, there was one supreme comfort that every child quietly yearned for, even though it usually meant you were unwell. Do you remember the magic of a cup of hot sugar water? White refined sugar was strictly rationed and incredibly precious. It was kept in a sealed glass jar on the highest shelf, reserved only for honored guests or times of illness. When you ran a high fever, your mother would gently take that jar down. The sound of the metal spoon scooping against the glass was the sound of pure love. She would place a spoonful of the glittering white crystals into a chipped enamel cup adorned with faded red peonies and pour boiling water over it. You would sit in bed, wrapped in heavy cotton quilts, watching the steam rise as she stirred it, the metal spoon clinking softly against the enamel sides. She would blow on it to cool it, then hold it to your lips. The liquid was warm, coating your sore throat with a sweet, soothing embrace that felt like a miraculous medicine. It was just water and sugar, yet in that cup was an outpouring of a mother's deepest anxiety and ultimate affection. We drank it slowly, savoring every sweet drop, feeling deeply cared for. Today, sweets are everywhere, but nothing will ever taste as intensely sweet and comforting as that simple cup of hot sugar water. Before refined white rice became a daily expectation, our rice bowls were often filled with grains that tested our jaws and our patience. Do you remember the deep red hue of sorghum rice? It was one of the cheapest, most abundant staple foods available, and for many families, it was the only thing standing between them and true hunger. Cooking sorghum was a labor-intensive chore. The hard grains had to be soaked for hours, sometimes overnight, just to make them edible. Even after boiling in the heavy iron wok for what felt like an eternity, the grains remained stubbornly firm. When you took a bite, the outer husk was thick and rough, scratching against the roof of your mouth and the back of your throat. It required serious, persistent chewing before you could even attempt to swallow it. We children often complained, wishing for the soft, snowy white rice that we only saw at weddings or the spring festival. Sorghum sat heavy in the stomach, and digesting it was hard work. Yet it was this very resilience that sustained the working people of our era. That coarse, red grain fueled the men and women who built our cities and worked the factories from dawn to dusk. Looking back at the bowl of smooth white rice we eat so effortlessly today, we cannot help but feel a profound respect for the rough, unyielding sorghum that got us through the hardest years. Not far from our neighborhoods, the local oil-pressing mill was a place of fascinating smells and intense labor. When the workers pressed peanuts to extract the precious cooking oil, they left behind massive, heavy discs of compressed residue, known as peanut cakes. Do you remember the dense, rock-hard texture of those cakes? Officially, these coarse, dry discs were meant to be used as fertilizer for the fields or feed for livestock. But to the children of our generation, they were a coveted snack. We would wait outside the mill, hoping to get our hands on a small, broken fragment. It was so hard that you could not bite into it directly without risking a broken tooth. Instead, you had to place a small piece in your mouth and let your saliva slowly soften the densely packed fibers. As you patiently gnawed on it for hours, a faint, roasted peanut flavor would slowly emerge, rewarding your persistence. It was incredibly dry, often making us cough, but the lingering taste of crushed peanuts was entirely worth the effort. In a time when actual whole roasted peanuts were a luxury reserved for the new year, this industrial byproduct was our makeshift candy. It taught us a beautiful truth of our childhood, that when you have absolutely nothing, you learn to extract joy, flavor, and sustenance from the things others have cast aside. Eggs were not just food, they were currency, a precious commodity traded at the supply cooperative for essential goods. Because of this, eating an egg was an incredibly rare event. You remember how our mothers could perform the miracle of making a single egg feed an entire family? The secret was the majestic egg drop soup. Your mother would place a large pot of water on the coal stove. As it reached the rolling boil, she would take exactly one egg from the straw basket, crack it into a small bowl, and beat it furiously with chopsticks until it was a frothy yellow liquid. Then, with a practiced, steady hand, she would hold the bowl high over the boiling pot and slowly drizzle the egg into the turbulent water in a thin, continuous stream. The instant the egg hit the hot water, it bloomed into delicate, flowing yellow ribbons, swirling like clouds in the pot. She would add a pinch of salt, perhaps a single drop of sesame oil if the bottle was not empty, and a scatter of chopped green onions. Suddenly a pot of plain water was transformed into a savory, comforting broth. We would each receive a large bowl of this soup, eagerly chasing the wisps of egg floating in the warm liquid. That one egg made us all feel nourished and cared for, proving that love and the mother's ingenuity could stretch the most meager resources to warm our hearts and our bellies. In the corner of many kitchens or dimly lit hallways sat a heavy brown earthenware jar that held a pungent, powerful secret. Do you remember the deep, fermented aroma of the pickled mustard greens? When fresh vegetables vanished from the markets during the long gray winters, these knobby, peculiar-looking roots were our constant companions. The process of making them was a messy, salty affair, packing the chopped greens tightly into the jars with an abundance of salt and fiery chili powder, then sealing them away to age in the darkness. Opening that heavy ceramic lid was an event. Your mother would fish out a dark, wrinkled lump, its surface coated in a thick, spicy red paste. With extreme precision, she would slice it paper-thin. The texture was incredible, dense and remarkably crunchy. When you placed a single sliver on your tongue, an explosion of intense saltiness, sourness, and spicy heat would instantly wake up your senses. It was the absolute perfect pairing for a bowl of thin, watery rice porridge, turning a bland, depressing meal into a fiery, flavorful experience. We relied on that intense crunch to break the monotony of our daily survival. Today, these pickles come neatly packaged in colorful plastic bags, but they lacked the soul, the sharp scent, and the profound sense of security that came from our mother's heavy earthenware jar. Long before the soft, buttery popcorn of modern movie theaters became common, we had our own loud, crunchy version of corn snacks. Do you remember the sound of dried corn kernels dancing on the iron surface of the coal stove? In the autumn, after the corn harvest was dried on the rooftops, we would sometimes beg our parents for a handful of the golden yellow kernels. We did not have oil to pop them, nor did these specific types of corn pop into fluffy white clouds. Instead, we simply scattered the rock-hard kernels directly onto the hot metal of the stove. We would watch intently, poking them with a chopstick so they would not burn. Soon they would crackle and pop, their skins splitting open slightly to reveal a darker, toasted interior. The smell of burning grain was deeply comforting. When they were sufficiently roasted and slightly blackened, we would scoop them quickly into our pockets. They were scorching hot, warming our frozen fingers on the long walk to school. Eating them was a serious challenge for the jaw. They were tough, incredibly crunchy, and sometimes felt like they might crack a tooth, but chewing them released a rich, earthy sweetness that filled the mouth. Those roasted kernels were our trusted companions, a humble snack born of fire and patience, bringing us simple joy in an era without luxury. The morning ritual in countless households across the country always began with a steaming bowl of yellow cornmeal porridge. Do you remember the incredibly thin, almost watery consistency of that daily staple? Flour and rice were strictly limited by the grain rationing books, so coarse cornmeal was the bedrock of our existence. Your mother would slowly whisk the rough yellow powder into a pot of boiling water, ensuring no lumps formed, until it thickened into a smooth, pale, golden soup. It had a very mild, slightly sweet, earthy aroma. Because we were always in a rush to leave for school or work, and the porridge was boiling hot, we developed a unique way of eating it. We did not use spoons. Instead, we held the rough ceramic bowl with both hands and placed our lips against the rim. We would slowly turn the bowl, slurping the porridge from the edges where it cooled the fastest, working our way to the center. The loud slurping sounds echoing around the small wooden table were the soundtrack of our mornings. It did not keep us full for long, and our stomachs would be rumbling again before noon. But as it slid down our throats, it provided the fleeting, beautiful rush of warmth that fortified us against the freezing dawn winds, tying our family together in the silent rhythm of a shared morning meal. Amidst the coarse grains and salty pickles that defined our daily diet, there existed a rare, delicate treat that felt like absolute luxury. You remember the mesmerizing process of preparing lotus root starch? It usually came in a small, plain paper box, purchased perhaps for an ailing grandparent, or as a special gift during the spring festival. It was a pale, dusty powder that required great skill to prepare correctly. If you used water that was not hot enough, it turned into an unappetizing, chalky lump. But when your mother poured rapidly boiling water into the bowl while stirring vigorously with a spoon, a breathtaking transformation occurred. Right before your eyes, the dull powder blossomed into a thick, translucent, shimmering paste with a faint, beautiful, pinkish hue. The aroma was incredibly subtle, carrying the gentle, aquatic sweetness of the lotus flower. If she added a tiny sprinkle of white sugar, it became a heavenly dessert. As children, we would watch the elders eat it, hoping they would leave a spoonful at the bottom of the bowl for us. It was warm, soothing, and glided effortlessly down the throat, a stark contrast to the rough sorghum and scratchy cornmeal we were used to. That small bowl of shimmering pink starch represented the highest form of elegance and care in a world dominated by rough edges and daily scarcity. Of all the memories of our youth, perhaps the most vividly joyful was the distant rhythmic clanging of the scrap vendor's hammer. Do you remember how your heart would leap at that sound? He was the man who carried blocks of the legendary malt sugar. We had no money to buy it, but currency in our world was different. We would frantically scour the house for old rubber shoe soles, empty metal toothpaste tubes, or scraps of iron. Clutching our treasures, we would sprint down the alleyway to the vendor's cart. He would weigh our junk, then take his small chisel and hammer, placing it against the massive, hard slab of yellowish-white malt sugar. With a sharp strike, a jagged piece would fracture off, dusted in a thin layer of white flour to keep it from sticking. We would place that hard rock of sugar in our mouths, and as it slowly melted, it became incredibly sticky, coating our teeth and filling our senses with a deep, complex, roasted sweetness that no modern candy can ever match. We would chew on that single piece of malt sugar for hours, sharing the joy with our friends in the dusty street. It was the ultimate alchemy of our childhood, trading absolute garbage for the sweetest treasure on earth. That piece of malt sugar was not just a candy. It was a symbol of the innocent, unbridled joy of being young, when the world was simple, and true magic could be found at the very end of the alley. As we look back at these 20 unforgettable foods, we realize a profound truth about our youth. We do not necessarily long to eat the rough, scratchy cornmeal bread again, nor do we truly miss the bitter wild herbs or the arduous task of chewing on hardened peanut oil residue. What we truly ache for, what brings that familiar lump to our throats, is the undeniable magic of the time itself. We miss the warmth of our mothers who could perform miracles with a single egg. We miss the fierce, unbreakable bonds formed over shared scarcity. We miss the innocence of a childhood where a tiny piece of malt sugar traded for an old shoe sole could make us feel like the wealthiest children on earth. The food was merely the vessel that carried the immense love, resilience, and spirit of our generation. Thank you for walking down this beautiful, bittersweet memory lane with me today. If these memories touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to help keep our history alive. Now, I want to ask you a question. Which of these foods instantly transported you back to your childhood kitchen? And what is your most cherished memory associated with it? Please share your stories in the comments below, because your memories are the true treasures of our time.